The history of slavery in America, the full story. History Vault Whitey, full narration script. Hook. By 1860, enslaved people in America were collectively worth more than all the railroads and factories in the United States combined. More than 4 million human beings had been reduced to property, a financial asset so enormous it shaped every corner of American life, politics, and identity. And yet, most people today cannot tell you how it started, how it evolved, or why it took a bloody war in 250 years to end it. Tease. In the next 10 minutes, you will get the full story, from the first African captives who arrived on American shores in 1619, through the brutal machinery of the plantation economy, all the way to emancipation and its complicated aftermath. We will cover the laws, the resistance, the economics, and the human cost. And we will reveal the one uncomfortable truth about American slavery that most textbooks still gloss over because it changes everything about how we understand this country today. Background. The story begins not in 1776, not with the Constitution, but in August of 1619. A British privateer ship called the White Lion docked at Point Comfort, Virginia, carrying what records describe as 20 and odd Negroes. These were Angolan captives, seized from a Portuguese slave ship crossing the Atlantic. They were sold to Virginia colonists for food and supplies. This was the opening chapter. But here is what most people miss: those first Africans in Virginia did not arrive into a fully formed slave system. In the earliest decades of colonial America, the legal lines between slavery and indentured servitude were blurry. Some Africans worked off their time and were freed. Some even acquired land. Anthony Johnson, an African man who arrived in Virginia around 1621, eventually earned his freedom, farmed 250 acres, and owned servants himself. This window closed fast. By the 1640s, Virginia courts began making critical distinctions. John Kaser became one of the first documented men declared a slave for life in 1640. By 1662, Virginia passed a law stating that the legal status of a child followed the status of the mother, not the father. This was called partus sequitur vent rem, a Latin legal principle borrowed from property law. In one stroke, it meant that any child born to an enslaved woman was enslaved at birth, regardless of the father. Slaveholders could now increase their workforce by violating the women they already owned. The system was no longer just economic. It was designed to reproduce itself indefinitely. The formalization accelerated through the late 1600s. Virginia's slave codes of 1705 consolidated dozens of earlier laws into a comprehensive legal framework. Enslaved people were declared property. They could not own goods, testify in court, or move freely. Conversion to Christianity, which had previously been used as a justification for freedom, was explicitly eliminated as a pathway out. The law had built a cage with no legal exit. Main content. By the 18th century, slavery was not a southern quirk, it was an Atlantic system. The transatlantic slave trade forcibly transported an estimated 12.5 million Africans to the Americas between 1500 and 1900. Approximately 400,000 of those individuals were brought directly to North America. The rest went to the Caribbean and South America, where mortality rates on sugar plantations were so catastrophic that populations had to be constantly replenished. In North America, by contrast, the enslaved population grew largely through forced reproduction, from that original handful in 1619 to over 4 million by 1860. The slave trade itself was a triangle. Ships left British and American ports carrying manufactured goods to the West African coast. There, merchants traded those goods for captured Africans, often prisoners of war sold by rival African kingdoms. The ships then crossed the Atlantic in what was called the Middle Passage. Captives were shackled lying down in spaces roughly the size of a coffin, with barely enough room to turn. Mortality rates during the crossing ranged from 15 to 25%. Disease, dehydration, and despair killed hundreds of thousands before they ever reached American shores. But here's what nobody talks about: the domestic slave trade inside America was just as brutal as the transatlantic one, and it continued for decades after the international trade was banned in 1808. Between 1820 and 1860, approximately 1 million enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Deep South. Families were shredded. Husbands separated from wives. Children torn from mothers. The domestic trade was so profitable that Virginia became known as a breeding state, a place where enslaved people were deliberately produced for sale further south. The plantation economy ran on cotton, tobacco, rice, and sugar. By 1860, the American South produced 75% of the world's cotton supply. That cotton fed the textile mills of Britain and New England. The profits funded banks in New York and London. Harvard University received substantial gifts from families whose fortunes were built on slavery. This was not a regional economy, it was a global one, and the entire industrializing Western world was entangled in it. What did daily life look like for an enslaved person? It depended on location and circumstance, but the constants were control, violence, and unpredictability. Enslaved people worked from before sunrise to after sunset during harvest season. Overseers, sometimes themselves poor white men, sometimes enslaved drivers appointed by owners, enforced productivity with whips. The law gave slaveholders near total power over the bodies of the people they owned. Punishment was arbitrary. Families existed at the pleasure of owners who could sell any member at any time. And yet, enslaved people resisted, constantly, creatively, and at enormous personal risk. Resistance took countless forms. Slowing down work without being caught. Feigning illness. Sabotaging tools and crops. Preserving African cultural practices, music, and religion in secret. Some resistance was open and violent. Nat Turner led a rebellion in Southampton County, Virginia in 1831 that killed approximately 60 white Virginians before being suppressed. The aftermath saw the state execute 56 black people and mob violence kill over 200 more. Rather than prompting reform, Turner's rebellion caused Southern states to tighten their slave codes dramatically, banning literacy for enslaved people and restricting free black people further. Deep dive. The question that historians have wrestled with for generations is this: how did a nation founded on the ideals of liberty and equality sustain this system for 250 years? The answer is both legal and psychological. The founders knew the contradiction. Jefferson, who owned over 600 people during his lifetime, wrote extensively about the immorality of slavery while never freeing those he enslaved in his lifetime. The Constitution protected slavery explicitly, counting enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for congressional representation, protecting the slave trade until 1808, and requiring that escaped enslaved people be returned to their owners. The ideology that justified all of this was constructed over time. By the early 19th century, Southern intellectuals like John C. Calhoun were openly arguing that slavery was not a necessary evil but a positive good, beneficial to the enslaved people themselves, who were described as childlike and incapable of self-governance. This was not fringe opinion. It was taught in churches, printed in newspapers, and argued on the Senate floor. Dehumanization was not incidental to the slave system. It was the system's operating manual. The abolitionist movement pushed back for decades. Frederick Douglass, who escaped slavery in 1838 and became the most prominent black voice of the 19th century, challenged the nation's hypocrisy directly. His famous 1852 speech asked the burning question, "What to the slave is the 4th of July?" Harriet Tubman made 13 missions back into slave territory and freed approximately 70 people. The Underground Railroad helped an estimated 100,000 enslaved people reach freedom over several decades. Analysis. The Civil War ended legal slavery when the 13th Amendment was ratified in December 1865. But emancipation was not a clean ending. Formerly enslaved people were freed with no land, no money, and no legal infrastructure protecting them. The brief period called Reconstruction offered genuine political progress. Black men voted and held office in significant numbers across the South. Then it was dismantled. By the 1880s and 1890s, Jim Crow laws, sharecropping systems that replicated plantation conditions, and systematic racial terror had rebuilt much of the power structure that emancipation was supposed to destroy. The economic legacy of slavery is measurable. Studies have shown that counties with higher rates of slavery before the Civil War show lower economic mobility and higher racial inequality today. The generational wealth stolen across 250 years of unpaid labor set the baseline for racial wealth gaps that persist into the 21st century. This is not ancient history. It is cause and effect across a documented timeline. Conclusion. American slavery was not an accident or an anomaly. It was constructed deliberately, legally enforced, economically central, and ideologically defended for 2.5 centuries. It touched every institution, finance, religion, law, education, and politics. Understanding it fully is not about assigning guilt to individuals today. It is about understanding the actual foundation on which this country was built, and why so many of its fault lines still run exactly where they do. CTA. Before you go, if this video opened your eyes, hit that like button right now. And subscribe to History Vault YT, we post every single day. Check out this video next, it goes even deeper on this topic. See you there.